Hello and welcome to the Warehouse Podcast. My name is Tyler, and welcome back to another off-season episode, the pre-World Series episode of this podcast. Unfortunately, our Baltimore Orioles will not be taking part in this year's World Series, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing to talk about. And in fact, there's actually been quite a bit of stuff happening with the Baltimore Orioles, which we're going to get into on this episode. But before we do that, I do want to give a shout out to our sponsor for the episode. And of course, it is Bet Online. Basketball fans, it's that time of year again. The NBA is back. From opening tip-off to buzzer beaters, Bet Online has you covered with the best odds, biggest promotions, and live in-game betting on all your favorite teams. This season, every game matters. Bet Online has every stat, matchup, breakdown, and live odds to bet on during the game. And it's not just the NBA. BetOnline has odds on everything from football, MLB playoffs, NHL to political props. So head to the website today, betonline.ag, to get in on the action with America's most trusted site for online wagering. That's BetOnline. The game starts here. Back to baseball, where our Baltimore Orioles, their season's been done for a few weeks now. We know that. We're kind of now moving into off-season territory for the Orioles. And what that'll mean in the future here is going to be some player movement, hopefully. There's a lot of stories around right now about the Orioles having, bigger pockets, deeper pockets this offseason, it being the first offseason of the new ownership group, which should mean the Orioles, who are primed to compete, to make a World Series run, to at least win a playoff game, should have the longitude to invest deeper in the Major League squad. So we hope that's coming. But until that, we have to wait until after the World Series for that. And even after that, really, it's usually Christmas time, a little bit past that, where the player movement for baseball really starts to take off. And we'll certainly cover that on the podcast when we get closer to that. But for now, the action we have to talk about is more internal. It's the organization, it's the clubhouse, because there's been quite a bit of movement in that regard since the Orioles were eliminated from the postseason by the Kansas City Royals a few weeks ago. So let's kind of, go back and talk about some of the things that have happened. So this is a report from the Sports Business Journal posted on October 10th, and it mentions some shifting around of things more on the business side of the Baltimore Orioles. I think the big one there is Greg Bader went from executive vice president and COO of the Orioles to executive vice president and GM of Masson. Masson could have a big shift for this year, as I think we all seem to understand that the regional sports network uh, business model is shifting. We just saw MLB recently is taking over the broadcasting of a lot of teams in the middle of the country. I think the Twins are in there. The Rockies might be in there. Maybe the Guardians. I'm not sure. I know it's a lot of more like central teams. That's because at their regional network kind of collapsed. The Orioles are one of the few teams that wasn't part and still isn't really part of one of those like conglomerates of like 3 or 5 teams. It's the Orioles and the Nationals on Masson, and really it's still the Orioles business. That's a whole complicated thing that I won't even get into, but that's one of the big things. TJ Brightman has left the organization, and Michael Hops, the senior vice president and CFO of the Orioles, plans to retire at the end of the year to spend more time with family. So a lot of these things are business side things. These are things that I think certainly will impact the consumer. We said Bader's moving to a position with Masson. Masson's going to be shifting. The Orioles might make some changes in terms of their offerings, whether that's promotions. That the previous ownership group was really concerned about concerts. We've had the whole land dispute thing over the last handful of years. Maybe this is incorporated there. So I think like on the business side of things, clearly things are shifting around with the Orioles' new ownership group. I don't think that's super surprising. I wouldn't think that these changes make too much of a change in your day-to-day enjoyment of the Baltimore Orioles the way that the team on the field does. So that's one thing that I'm not really going to get into, but I did want to talk about it because it's one of the things changing. A bigger change was in the clubhouse, a lot of coaching changes and still some things in limbo right now, but I think the top line stories are two of the co-hitting coaches are gone, Ryan Fuller and Matt Borgschult. Borgschult, we know, is going to the Twins to serve as their hitting coach now. So he's not really, going to a lesser role. He's, if anything, going to a promotion, a full-time, the only hitting coach versus a co-hitting coach with other players or other coaches. You can understand how that maybe is attractive there. Fuller sounds like he left on his own volition as well. Then there is Freddie Gonzalez will no longer be the bench coach, and then Major League Coach Jose Hernandez is also no longer going to be with the coaching staff. So a lot of shifting things there. I think people really go and look at the hitting coach changes because the Orioles offense was just so poor really after the All-Star break. Adley Rutschman in particular was kind of a disaster after the All-Star break. Was he hurt? Was he not? Not so sure, but whatever it was, his performance at the plate was not up to the standard. And then Freddie Gonzalez, it sounds like, according to reports, that he was shocked by the decision to, relieve him of his duties as bench coach. And then the major league coach, Jose Hernandez, I haven't really heard too much reporting on his departure. But what I think a lot of this shows is that Brandon Hyde will be on something of a hot seat in 2025. The Orioles don't make it public knowledge what the contract situations are for their coaches. Brandon Hyde might be on an expiring deal. I don't really know. We know he's coming back next year. Mike Elias made that clear in his press conference right after the season ended. But clearly, the Orioles need to do better in 2025 than they did in 2024. This whole rebuild, building towards the future is all well and good. I think even the most calloused Orioles fan can tell you that it has in general been a success. The Orioles have gone from a dumpster fire, even prior to the Buck Showalter era, one of the most mismanaged organizations in baseball. Had some success when they got some veteran decision makers in there, but clearly didn't really build a foundation that was repeatable long term. Elias has come in, I think, shored up the foundation of the organization to the point that the organization has a lot of talent in it, has an ability to improve players that come into the organization. I think that base is now solid. But now it's about lifting that ceiling of the organization at the major league level, which the Orioles haven't really done yet. They have, yes, they've made the playoffs, but they have not made deep runs in what I think have been wide open American leagues the last 2 years. The Yankees are in the World Series this year. Yankees are a good team. The Orioles were right with the Yankees all season. And I think at certain parts, it seemed pretty obvious that the Orioles were actually the better, deeper team. But regardless, the Yankees pulled it together for the playoffs and had a team that has found fairly easy success through the playoffs. Yes, they lost a game to the Royals. They lost two game or maybe one game to the Guardians, but in general has made it pretty easily through the American League. The Orioles could have done that exact thing. They didn't do that. And then last year, we saw the Rangers come in as a buzzsaw, crush the Orioles, crush a lot of teams. So I don't really feel, like the Orioles were too much to blame last year, but at the same time, the Rangers came kind of out of nowhere to do that. The Orioles were the best team in the American League most of last season, obviously ended up with the best record. The Orioles could have done more there. So, all that to say, Brandon Hyde needs this team, needs the Orioles to improve next year, and therefore he is on something of a hot seat that I think if the Orioles don't make the playoffs, he's probably gone. If they do make the playoffs but have a similar short showing, Brandon Hyde could probably be gone as well because the core is the core right now. The core is affordable right now of Henderson and Rutschman, and throw Cowser in there, throw Grayson Rodriguez in there. It's cheap, it's high performing in general, apart from Rutschman's second half. They need to take advantage of it, and if Hyde isn't part of that conversation to get them there, I think he's going to be gone. So the fact that they are churning up the big league staff this year is kind of indicative of that. We saw them do this with the pitching coaches last year. The pitching, I think, for what the pieces they had was very impressive this year. Obviously, Corbin Burns did exactly what he needed to do. A lot of injuries around Corbin Burns, and the pitching was still pretty solid, despite, I think, what you would kindly describe as subpar talent. Yes, Zach Eflin came in later in the season, but lots of injuries, not even like season ending stuff, the way that, the Bradish injury was and the Means injury was and the Wells injury was. But also Rodriguez missed a lot of time. Obviously, Bautista wasn't in there. The bullpen was kind of a mess at times. Craig Kimbrell falling apart. A lot of things didn't go to plan for the pitching, and yet the pitching still ended up pretty good. And in the postseason, you certainly cannot blame the pitching staff for dropping the ball. They allow 3 runs over 2 games, and we lose both of those games, not because of the pitchers, but because the hitters just couldn't produce. And there is the reason you're likely seeing a shakeup of the hitting coaches this year is didn't get the job done. And maybe there's conversations internally to say, hey, why didn't this happen this way? Or why was this done this way? maybe those answers were unsatisfactory. Maybe the organization suggested some changes going forward, and it seems like Fuller and Borgschult either didn't agree with them or felt they had better opportunities elsewhere, or Borgschult's going to another major league team, so this wouldn't apply to him. But Fuller, maybe he doesn't like the major league coaching scene. Maybe he wants to go back to the minors or go to a college program or something. We don't know yet. The Fuller situation hasn't been fully expanded on, but clearly something needed to be shaken up, and that's kind of the result here. And Gonzalez, being kind of the number two in the dugout behind Hyde, um, sort of a sacrificial lamb sort of situation there. Not that I think Hyde was going to get fired this year, but I think clearly there were some tough conversations with Hyde from the front office to say, like, look, dude, whatever you were doing day to day, it was great in the first half. It kind of fell apart in the second half, and then the playoffs were essentially a disaster. There were a couple questionable decisions you made when it came to pitching to Bobby Witt, to not bunt with James McCann. Where are you getting this advice from? Is it all based off of our numbers we're providing you from the front office? Is it based off of gut stuff? You're going over the conversations with Freddie. You know, if it's the latter, then maybe we need to make some changes here. So I think that's kind of what you're seeing there. Let's keep going on some other changes. It sounds like there's some changes in the scouting department. Bill Wilkes, Ben Sussman, Hyde, and Sam Burke are not going to return to the advanced scouting department. But still, there's other people that are staying in place. So I think, again, advanced scouting, these are the folks that, go ahead of the team, look at your upcoming opponents, give you some feedback on things that you can do to improve your approach against them. Again, things were good early on. It seemed like in the second half of the year, other teams' advanced scouts were doing a better job than our advanced scouts, where they were exploiting weaknesses of the Orioles, and the Orioles weren't exactly able to do the same in the reverse. So maybe, again, needs to be a change of things there. We shouldn't have such a distinct delineation between the first half and the second half in terms of performance when the injuries were largely to the pitching staff, not to the hitting. Yes, Westberg went down for a long time. Mountcastle missed some time. Rutschman was whatever Rutschman was doing, but compare that to losing an ace type in Bradish, a really good quality depth guy in Means, a guy that probably was a part of the bullpen picture in Tyler Wells, and then even throw Felix Bautista in there. You lose an all-world closer. I think for most teams, you'd expect the pitching staff to fall apart, and that's not what happened. It was that hitting side of things just showed no improvement in the second half of the year. I don't think it's a lack of effort. I don't think it's a lack of desire or any of those things. It just didn't pan out. And at this point where the Orioles are, that's not acceptable anymore. The Orioles need to be ascending, not flatlining or even descending, which is what this year felt like. This year felt like a regression. And that's just not where the Orioles can be right now. They need to be on the uptrend. They need to be taking advantage of what feels like an American League that is there for the taking. And they just didn't do that this year. So I think that's interesting as well. And then finally, the latest news is that Brian Ebel, the Orioles athletic trainer, is not going to be back for 2025. Ebel's a guy that has been in the organization for 40 years. I think he started at like the rookie league level as like a 19-year-old as the athletic trainer, has worked his way up. I read that he'd been at the major league level for 20 some years, and then obviously took over for Richie Mancel's in, I believe it was 2017, 2018. So he's been the Orioles head athletic trainer for 7, 8 years, and was even part of like the contingent that went to the All-Star game this year. Now, what does that mean in the realm of athletic trainers? I couldn't tell you, but I think the fact that a guy's been around for 4 decades in one organization, has withstood multiple changes at the top of the organization, multiple ownership groups, because that was even before the Angeloses took over. So you withstand that, Angelos, and now you're the Rubenstein ownership group. I think it's a guy that knows what he's doing, is good at his job, and just at this point is no longer going to be that. We don't know, and there's no speculation here that he has been fired or let go. We just know he's not going to be back next year. We also don't know if any of his lieutenants are going to be back either. If they are, I think you would have to expect, okay, well, Ebel, and we'll probably get more reporting on this. Ebel, been around the game for 40 years, did the big league job for a while now. It might just be time to do different stuff for you personally. Being a major league athletic trainer is a grind, just like it is as for the players. You're probably there as early as anybody and as late as anybody, getting players the treatment that they need. And you're traveling a lot. If you have family, you're not with your family for large swaths of the summer. I'm sure that is a grind and is tough. And if that is something that Brian Ebel at this point in his life wants to move on from, I think that's a totally legitimate reason to leave the organization. So again, no clue, but again, it is another change that has happened for the Baltimore Orioles this year at a time that feels like an inflection point for the organization. They are at a point where they are a very good team year to year. We're now 3 years in a row of winning baseball, of contending baseball. They need to get over that hump, and whatever helps them get there, they need to do this offseason because you have to strike while the iron is hot. Sounds like this ownership group is willing to spend some money. We'll see what that looks like. There's been reports. Rubenstein has said, I'm 75. I'm probably not going to be doing this for 20 more years. It's time to like go. Baltimore guy, I think they spend money, but there's a difference between spending money and spending money wisely. Hopefully, they will spend the money wisely. But the core right now is very good. They just need to add those couple of players and maybe those voices in the room to get them to that next step. It doesn't mean winning 101 games again, but it does mean likely winning the division, going deep into the playoffs. Again, I don't think this team is a World Series or bust kind of team in 2025, but they are an advance in the playoffs or bust type of team. I think you'd even say they're an ALCS or bust type of team in 2025 because if you can't get there next year, the price tag starts to go up for some of these players. Henderson, Rutschman entering arbitration. While I believe Rubenstein's willing to spend more, there's limits to all things. We're not going to be the New York Mets. We're not going to be the New York Yankees. We're not going to be the Los Angeles Dodgers. There's a obviously a difference there, and there's plenty of gap that the Orioles have to work with, probably $100 million or more, $150 million or more. So there's plenty of room to spend there, but obviously you need to spend wisely. And I think right now is that time to really go for the gusto and put the Orioles in a position where they are, a World Series favorite in the top two or three year after year for the next 3, 4 years. And if they don't do that, I think that's a failure. So what I'll say is all these changes, I appreciate them from Mike Elias's perspective, from the Orioles organization's perspective, is you can't retread 2024 again. Obviously, there's a lot of things you need to carry forward, and you will in terms of the players. You're not going to overhaul the roster. There's really no reason to. You know you're potentially losing Santander and Burns. Maybe you sign them both. Maybe you sign one of them. That's cool. But again, that's just bringing back what you already had. You're going to get Bautista back. That's already an improvement in the bullpen. Kimbrel's gone. That's a net gain. But other than that, you need something else. You need another player. You need another two players to push this team forward. And I think in addition to that, get some other voices in the room, some fresh eyes on things to say, hey, did you think about doing things this way? Or what about this approach? Or hey, we noticed this weakness in the opponent. We saw last year with the Red Sox. Remember what they did to the Yankees that one weekend at Fenway, where they ran all over them out of nowhere. Now, obviously, the Red Sox didn't make the playoffs. The Yankees are in the World Series. There's a difference in terms of player talent. That probably explains that. But obviously, their advanced scouts had found something that said, you can exploit this and you can have a nice, fun weekend at Fenway because the Yankees are not good at this right now. The Orioles, it would be great to have advanced scouts that can do something similar to that to benefit the Orioles moving forward. And we just didn't really see that. We saw them kind of flatline last year. And the same thing from the hitting coach perspective. Let's try something different. Hey, Adley, you've struggled for 3 straight months. Maybe we need to switch something up. We need to switch a stance. We need to switch an approach, something, versus it didn't feel like that was happening. I know we had quotes from Rutschman after the year. He's been in the hitting cage with the coaches working on stuff. I believe it, but whatever he was doing, it just didn't materialize on the field, unfortunately. And maybe some new voices can change that. And then in the training staff, I there were no injury issues with the Orioles last year that to me are chalked up to trainer, struggles. You're getting elbow injuries from pitchers. That's kind of just the norm in Major League Baseball anymore. So you don't blame that. And then you had Westberg get hit on the hand and break a bone, and then the same thing to Cowser late in the year. Like those aren't pulled hamstrings, those aren't muscle strains, those aren't things that like the training program is off and players are tweaking things. These are major freakish things that happen that's why I say I don't believe the Ebel change is really firing as much as it is he as a person felt like I've been doing this a long time and it's time for me to do something else going into my 60s. But at the same time, it's a new person, it's a new voice, it's a new perspective. I think this team could use some of that. And I think that mentality will be utilized in the free agent world, in the trade world, in bringing talent into the organization as well. I think you've got the young guys in house that know how to play baseball the way the Orioles want you to play baseball. They've found success in terms of hitting the ball hard or hitting the ball in the air, or you can nitpick some of that stuff. But they know how to do things to a successful degree to get to the major leagues, to get to the major leagues fast, and to succeed at the major league level. Now you need that voice, that older voice, that veteran voice that can say, yeah, that might work in Norfolk. That might even work in Baltimore, April through August. But in September at Yankee Stadium, when you're a game back of the division, this is what you need to be doing. This is the mentality you have to have. Oh, it's October and you're in an elimination game in the ninth inning with the bases loaded. Think about this when you're at the plate. The Orioles need one or two of those guys that give them a fresh perspective that don't necessarily talent wise lift the ceiling in that way. They don't push this team from a 90 win team to a 98 win team, but they could push that team from a team that goes home in the wild card round to a team that is playing game 7 of the ALCS. I do believe that because the playoffs, we've talked about it before. The playoffs are a different beast. It is it is situational baseball. It is close games. It every runner on base feels like three runners on base. There's just a shift that needs to be made mentally and approach wise that right now these Orioles don't have, and maybe coaches make an incremental change there. I think a player or two makes an incremental change, but clearly something needs to change. So I appreciate the Orioles making some of these changes. Particularly, I think we want to focus on these changes in the dugout. Ryan Fuller, Matt Borgschult, not going to blame them for the entirety of the Orioles' struggles, but the players need a new voice. Same thing with Freddie Gonzalez, Jose Hernandez on the bench. Maybe Brandon Hyde needs a different voice in his ear to say like, hey, what about this or what about that? Or hey, I noticed this player's doing this lately. Let's try that. Obviously, I'm not giving you actual concrete examples, but I think the mantra, the theory makes a lot of sense. And if we look to the Houston Astros of Mike Elias's era when he was more of a second or third in command, a scouting guy, when they brought in Carlos Beltran, although I know obviously there was some more complicated parts of that relationship when it comes to the cheating allegations, realities rather. Clearly, Carlos Beltran was not a huge help on the field. His numbers that season were not good, but as far as a voice in the ear of the young Astros at that time, made a difference. So something like that, sans the cheating, I think would make a lot of sense for the 2025 Baltimore Orioles. So all that to say, a lot of changes, a lot of things happening that we don't exactly know what the end is going to be. We don't know who the replacements are going to be. People have talked about Buck Britton. I don't have a huge opinion on that. It is definitely a younger voice. It's a guy that's maybe more in tune with the younger players, whereas maybe Gonzalez, an older guy who I've only heard positive things about, but maybe he had an outdated view of how to do some things. Maybe Buck Britton has more of a, 2025 way of approaching game situations. So that's just as important, but there needed to be a shakeup. You weren't going to totally change the roster overnight, probably make a few tweaks there, but the coaching staff is an area where you can make changes. And I think, obviously this is an indication that the Orioles are approaching 2025 with a positive mindset of going deeper than they ever have before. And I also think it shows that Brandon Hyde, it's on you in 2025, man. Yeah, it's not really about the regular season. We know you can win games in the regular season. That's great. You need to win postseason games. So make some changes to your coaching staff, and 2025 is what it all comes down to. Success. Here's a contract extension. Failure. Maybe you want to start thinking about another role somewhere. But yeah, that's really all I wanted to touch on today. We will have some more off-season stuff here coming up in the next few days and weeks. I think what we're going to get into is some position by position recaps of the season. And, as part of that, maybe think about where the Orioles go in 2025. Do they stand pat in all these positions, or is there room to improve? If so, who do they go after? I think that's kind of what we're going to pivot to here in the next few weeks. So to make sure you're getting all of that stuff as it comes through, Please subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. We are available there. Go over to Believe.com. We are part of the Believe Podcast Network. Head over to Believe. There's a show for everybody. If you're an Orioles fan, On the Verge has a podcast here. They do a great job with Orioles news. In particular, they do a great job with the young players, the minor league players. They cover that stuff in a way that nobody else does, so check them out. And if you're not just an Orioles fan, if you have a football fandom or a soccer fandom or a basketball fandom, Believe has a podcast for you, so check them out. And thank you to Bet Online for the support of this episode. And then finally, follow us on social media at The Warehouse Pod on X and on Threads is where we are there. But that is gonna about do it for this episode. I appreciate you all for listening so much. Until next time, my name is Tyler, and this has been the Warehouse Podcast. Take it easy.